Is this working all right? Yeah, great. All right. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thanks to all of you joining in person and online this evening for our panel. My name is Ian Cochran. I am Senior Advisor at I4C, Institute for Climate Economics, and also the head of the Mainstreaming Climate in Financial Institutions initiative, or head of the Secretariat of the initiative. And tonight I have the pleasure of welcoming all of you, as well as our great lineup of speakers who are connecting both online but also have joined us in person for our conversation on how public development banks are increasing their contribution to the adaptation goal of the Paris Agreement. I think all of us know very clearly that we've made quite a bit of progress discussing about alignment and contribution to the mitigation goal of the Paris Agreement, but where we know there's still further progress to be made, and we think there's a lot of really great work that's been going on over the last couple years, is around the topic of adaptation and associated subjects of resiliency, and of course, everything around Article 2.1b. So, oops, I'm holding the wrong thing. Let me just click to the next slide. There we go, doing the slides as well. So just maybe a quick word before we do dive into today's program about who we are. Some of you might recognize the logo and the fancy colors, but not necessarily the name. And that's because just last week we did launch our new name, Mainstreaming Climate in Financial Institutions. We used to be called Climate Action in Financial Institutions, as we think that this new name definitely better reflects what we're doing together as a group, and really how we bring together public and private financial institutions to dialogue and exchange on practices related to climate change, its integration into their activities, and everything that they're doing in terms of their business model, as well as really how they can then, as we're doing in today's event, share with the broader climate community their progress on different topics. And of course today, if I move to the next slide, the focus on adaptation and the Paris Agreement goals. So just to give a quick overview of what we're looking to do in today's session, we do have a very strong panel today that is really going to bring insights from across the public development finance and public bank community about what they've been doing in the last couple of years around the adaptation goal. So we'll start tonight's session with two presentations. Firstly, hearing from Michael Mullan, Climate Change Adaptation and Development and the Environment Directorate at the OECD, who will be speaking to us about some of the recent work that he's been involved with. And then we'll hear from Vivian Depoues, project manager at I4CE, of course my own institution, home institution, Institute for Climate Economics, who will be talking about the Adaptaton project that they've been working on in France and exploring the role that, again, public finance, and particularly from public financial institutions, can play in supporting adaptation. We'll then move into the panel part of today's session, where it's both a panel discussion, but also, I think, really a panel where we're seeking to share experience and provide a little bit more detail on the practice that we see among PBDs around the world. So we'll be hearing first during that panel, from Nabil Kadri, Head of Environment from BNDES, and I do hope I pronounced that properly, probably not, excuse me. And he'll be talking about the work that they've been doing. We'll then hear from Sarah Duff, Principal, Green Economy and Climate Action at the EBRD, who will be giving us particularly insights on measuring adaptation impact of interventions. Sarah will be then followed by Véronique Morin, Senior Climate Change Specialist at the World Bank, who will be talking to us about, their resilience rating system. And then finally, we'll hear from Christophe Buffet, Climate Change Adaptation Expert at the AFD, who will be talking about how they've been supporting countries to implement adaptation strategies, and particularly that key piece of drawing in investment. So I think, as you can see, we'll be covering a broad range of topics, and it'll be a relatively dense, but I think very, hopefully, useful set of presentations. And then we will, of course, have time at the end for a round of questions and discussion. And I think that will be both those of us in the room, but also able to take questions from those participating online. So to get things started, I will hand things over to Michael to talk to us about what they've been doing at the OECD on this topic. So Michael, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Does this work?
Yeah, I think you have to be pretty close.
Like this? Ah, okay. That's grand.
Give you the clicker. Sorry.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Mullan. I'm Program Lead for Adaptation, Finance and Investment at OECD. Look, I'm really delighted that this event has been organized. I think it's a crucial topic. I'm going to provide a bit of preamble before we then move into the other speakers. So, I want to start with an obvious point, but an important point, which is that both, the IPCC AR6 and frankly our own experience is showing us about the increasing pace, severity, and systemic scale of climate change impacts. So we see this happening, and we also, I don't know what the beeping is, but I assume it's fine, so I'll keep going. But also that investment decisions made for non-climate reasons will affect our ability to adapt to these climate impacts, whether it be for infrastructure, whether it be for agriculture, whether it be for innovation. All of these investment flows will either make it easier or harder for us to adapt to the climate change impacts that we're faced with. And you also see this in terms of a sense of scale. So I'm sure many of you, probably all of you, will have seen the recent CPI figures on adaptation finance, which identified the 49 billion. But I think it's worth comparing that with every year we're spending, well, investing 2.7 trillion in new infrastructure. And this is not predominantly for climate change reasons. It's to provide access to mobility, to energy, to clean water, etc. But the point is that the type of infrastructure that's built, where it's built, how it's operated and maintained, again, will either make us more or less vulnerable to climate change impact. And so if we just focus exclusively on the 49 billion, we're missing the impact of these much broader trends. Oops. Which brings us to Article 2.1c. This was recognized in the Paris Agreement that it's not just about dedicated finance for mitigation and adaptation, but that all finance flows should be consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And yet, just as you read the newspapers or you listen to discussions, a lot of Paris alignment is on the mitigation side, and the adaptation side seems to be somewhat silent, which is why I'm really delighted that we're having this discussion this evening. And I think it's worth emphasizing this is not my finest kind of creative moment, but I'm just trying to make a point here, which is that physical climate risk management is not the same as adaptation alignment. The two things are related, but they are not the same. On the one hand, you can manage your physical risks in a way that just passes that risk on to someone else. So, for example, you can face irregular rainfall by further depleting groundwater supplies. So for you, that's fine. For the other people who depend on the same aquifer, it's just increasing their vulnerability. Similarly, from an adaptation perspective, there's a lot about education, about capacity, which is not directly linked to the management of any given physical risk, but is nonetheless going to be essential as we face increasingly severe climate impacts. So we have this goal in Article 2.1c. Hopefully you're all bought into the idea that this is something that's important and worth aiming for. But how do we operationalize it? How do we know if we're making any progress? What does it mean to say something is adaptation aligned? And I've just drawn out some of the challenges we face in doing this. The first, and I think most obvious one, is the lack of a clearly defined goal. Adaptation is a process, but what does it mean to say we are adaptation aligned? How are we aligning to that process? This shows complexity, the lack of examples of business opportunities, the existence of policy frameworks that have been designed for a static climate. So again, whether it be procurement policies, whether it be building standards, whether it be regulatory arrangements, these have all developed over decades with a static climate. And now we're faced with adjusting that to a changing climate, and a changing climate that has systemic impacts. So these are the problems. What are some of the solutions? I'm not going to delve too much into this because the subsequent speakers will really get into the details. But I think it's just worth saying that the public development banks have really been at the forefront of thinking on this. They've really been spearheading what does it mean to say something is aligned, and I will let them get into the details of it later. But I'd just like to highlight a few kind of common themes from this. Firstly, you have a defined use of proceeds. So there are approaches that are developed predominantly for you know what the money is going for in a fairly specific sense, and you can then run through a process of risk assessment, risk management, and checking consistency with adaptation planning. Secondly, you have a process-based focus. So the key thing is not, it's not like a mitigation where you can say, this is the green technology, this is not the green technology. Rather, it's, have you been through a process of risk assessment with an open question about what's your ambition level here? What's your acceptable level of risk? A positive framing. So it's about saying these are the aligned projects and not really accept implicitly these are the misaligned activities. Then a resilience of resilience through. So it's firstly, is this intervention that we're doing for another reason resilient to climate impacts, the resilience of, or is this an intervention that's really aiming to enhance adaptation by others, is making it easier, cheaper for others to affect, has positive social spillover benefits. And then this question about systemic impacts. This hasn't been covered in particular depth so far. It's more been a focus of, is this intervention consistent with the adaptation strategies that are in place, or at least not inconsistent with that? And then varying degrees of requirements on monitoring. So this very simplistic diagram is trying to set out a more generalizable framework for what might count as adaptation-aligned finance. And you'll see it basically has 3 elements to it. The first one is physical risks are assessed and managed. The second one is do no significant harm. What that means is you're managing your risk in a way that is not increasing the risk of other people, either directly by shifting risk or indirectly by increasing emissions or being not consistent with net zero, thereby increasing the underlying problem. And then thirdly, consistency with adaptation plans insofar as they exist. We've also drawn out so-called positive alignment, which is where an intervention is making a claim, a green bond, a resilience bond. It's saying not just this isn't bad, but this is making a positive contribution. There has to be some evidence that this is making it easier or cheaper to adapt in future. So where does that take us? We think this is a crucial topic. I think a lot of work has been done by the public development banks. Really looking forward to the discussion just now. In other areas, domestic public finance, in private finance, I think we're generally at an earlier stage. So the OECD and partners are looking at 3 things. Firstly, we're looking at defining what it means to be aligned and convening interested parties to be part of that discussion. Secondly, measuring. I think if you have a goal, you need to have some sense of, are we making progress towards it? So over the next year, we'll be aiming to quantify the degree of adaptation alignment, starting with certain key sectors. And then ultimately, thirdly, mobilizing. I mentioned before, we have OECD policy focus. We have policy frameworks that have developed over time based on a static climate. What are the priorities for adjusting that so we can achieve greater alignment over time and ultimately be better adapted to the severe climate impacts that we face? With that, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. I think that provides a great introduction. And if you actually wouldn't mind just clicking for me to the next slide, a great introduction both to the conversations of today, but I think, again, simple is often better. So I actually think it's often great that we can arrive to a relatively simple set of principles that still provide us a robust framework to thinking it again about the physical risk, the do no significant harm, and that consistency with adaptation plans, and of course, above all saying, and in particular for PBDs, how do you then have a positive contribution, not just in a resilience of, but resilience through? Because I think it's really there where the public funds have a role to play in helping us move beyond making sure they've managed their risks, but really helping society manage risks as a whole. I'd like now to turn to one of our online speakers, so to my colleague Vivian. So Vivian, I think you're there, and if we could get perhaps Vivian up on the screen, although I think Vivian has slides, so we may not see Vivian, we'll see his slides rather than him, but we'll see Vivian later for the discussion. Or I don't know if you can do both Vivian and slides at the same time. I don't know if the screen's has that magic. Vivian, I will be your host, so please let me know when you'd like me to click forward to the next slide.
Okay, thank you again, and good evening, everyone. Yes, so I think we can start with the first slide now. I don't see them. Yeah, next one, please. Thank you. What I will present tonight is based on the work we conducted in the one specific context, which is the French context, trying to understand how to move forward on this question of adaptation and how to take this objective more systematically into account when financing local economic development in that specific country. So the results are first relevant for France, but we think that they can provide insights to feed the more collective discussion, and the result might be useful more broadly, as adaptation is actually a challenge for every country, including European countries, and is not just a question of the amount of funding available. So we can move to the next slide, please. And I think that we have all understood with what Michael has just presented, that when I talk about financing a resilient economic development in countries, I mean both financing some adaptation projects dedicated to adaptation like flood defenses or, I don't know, digitalization of cities. But I mainly talk about mainstreaming adaptation into structuring investments, for instance, investments in infrastructure, buildings, or more broad economic development. So even in a country in which the public goods are pretty well financed, like France, we observed at the beginning of our work that we actually noticed very few investments directly dedicated to adaptation, and adaptation which was far from being mainstream in those structuring investments. So in France, as in many countries, I think we faced this classical apparent paradox. Next, please. That we know that the let's say the macroeconomic rationale for adaptation looks pretty obvious. We all know those figures that showing those are from the GCA, that there are many investments in adaptation which might be highly profitable, but that adaptation doesn't happen by itself. There is a very rich literature on that. We know that with adaptation, there are huge governance issues that we have to look more cautionally on how the costs and benefits of adaptation are distributed over time. And so that to really move forward on adaptation, which is the objective, we first need to make sure that some prerequisites, and that's the next slide, are actually met. And supporting adaptation is first and foremost about being sure that the resources, which are financial resources, but also human resources, are there to create a pipe of adapted projects and adaptation projects downstream. So those conditions are very simple, very well known, I think. They are about creating an enabling environment for adaptation, which means providing information, but also being sure that local, regional strategies exist, that there is a consensus for adaptation. In France, we have examples, for instance, around water uses, on which there are conflicts of users between farmers and other users, and we know that to be able to invest in new water infrastructure, in water efficiency, we first need to reach a shared view and an accepted strategy on water uses before moving down to adaptation. Then, second condition is about technical assistance. Adaptation is a new topic. It requires new skills, specific knowledge, a new expertise that all actors do not immediately have. So technical assistance is really critical. It's one of the bottlenecks. Then next, we need to really cover the extra costs of adaptation when there are extra costs. And if we move to the next slide, we see that all those three challenges actually are challenges that public financial institutions can really contribute to address. And I would even say that they have a responsibility to do so, because those challenges are perfectly in line with their mandate of general interest, providing public goods and sustainable, resilient development. Those challenges are totally relevant with their historical role in supporting major transformations in the economy, and adaptation is part of ongoing major transformations, because they have the assets to do so, both the economic and financial capacity and the technical capacity, the expertise to do so. They have, being long-term investors, the ability to combine general interest and the posture of a cautious financial actor. And they also have a strategic interest in listening to the emerging demands and addressing them in the relationship with their counterparts. And if we move to the next slide, we have probably our main and very simple message, which is that there is a role for almost anyone in those institutions to contribute to adaptation. We completely agree with what Michael has just said, that adaptation is different and is not just about risk management. It's not just part of the financial process somewhere in the institution. It's really a challenge to get every business unit in those institutions on board for adaptation, starting, next slide, with the top management of the institution and anyone within those institutions who will contribute, like the public speeches, public relationship of the institution, because at the point we are today, at least in the context we have studied in France, there is really a challenge to put that topic on the agenda, to show that we really need to take adaptation into account, that this is financially important, that this is socially important, and we have the capacity to do so. And public financial institutions can really contribute to that by taking adaptation as a strategic objective, stated it, that talking about it with their counterparts, their stakeholders, with other public actors. And this is not anecdotic at all, that it's really a first important step. The next step, and that's the next slide, is about this question of technical capacities and technical support that I was mentioning. Technical support for new topic, adaptation issues. For instance, I don't know, supporting municipalities and especially smaller municipalities to conduct vulnerability assessment and to build a consistent strategy to deal with the heat island effects and find dedicated spatial planning projects, but also and probably mainly trying to mainstream adaptation into routine daily technical assistance to make sure, and that's really, really a critical point, that we are able to detect the projects that have to be adapted upstream enough to be able to take adaptation into account and make resilient projects upstream enough. Then, and I've almost finished, next slide, we reach the point of financing adaptation directly, which once again might be a few dedicated financial products for some particular issues, but that's mainly about, once again, mainstreaming adaptation into what is financed, which, and what Michael was saying, is first about raising the question into the process, talking about the process of analyzing risks and adaptation strategy with the counterparts, and trying to make this topic living into the relationship between the investor or the financer and its counterpart. And with adaptation, we very often not have just one small project or action, but strategies made of consistent and multiple actions that have to be financed together to be efficient. For instance, in coastal management, you have to, at the same time, make sure that you address very urgent needs for safety of installation and people, for instance, repairing dikes, and at the same time to plan for the future and try to anticipate more transformative changes like relocations of activities. And to do that, you might need a specific expertise, financial engineering, to provisioning the resources to do so, to have deposit mechanism, a compulsory deposit mechanism as we have since recently in France, and for that, public financial institutions are very important actors. And to do so, to meet all those roles, and that's the next and last slide, the PFIs first have to get organized to do so. They have to really build internal capacity, and this is an important point. Adaptation is a new topic with new issues, and they have to raise capacity internally and to talk with their counterparts and stakeholders about that. They have to get the tools to do so, to take ownership of those tools. There are many examples in different parts of the world, and we will have examples just now with the discussion. And I think that initiatives such as the mainstreaming initiatives are very nice place to share about those tools. And public actors and private actors as well have to be coordinated to meet the challenges of adaptation. PFIs will not be able to meet all adaptation needs alone. It's not just about finance needs, it's also about policy needs. And for that, the general public policy framework is really critical. And I will stop there. You have on the last slide the sum up of what I've just said today, and can answer questions later. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Vivian. I think that was really building on what Michael was saying, and very much complementary, of course, in terms of the scope of actions, the type of activities, or the type of roles that PBDs can play, or PFIs. But I think that focus on the human component, on the fact that this is really about making sure that the different cogs in the wheel, although of course people are much more than that, can really have the capacity and the tools that they need in order to do so. And that's, of course, something that we attempt to do in our initiative, which is to exchange on those tools. And I think that really is a great segue into our panel, because we are now going to hear from those people who are working internally to support, and I'll go to the next slide. To that panel with, there we go. That are really going to present some concrete examples of what they're doing at an institutional level, and then of course how we're measuring, how we're rating, and then of course how we're supporting the implementation of strategies. So what I'll do now is ask Nabil and Christophe to join me up on the little stage here. And we'll first hear from Nabil about what BNDES is doing on this, and then of course we'll kind of alternate back and forth. Or Christophe, if you'd like to stay there so you can see, because again, for those not here in the room, you can't really see the slides if you have your back to it. But we'll go ahead, and I think Nabil, you don't have any slides, so yes, please tell us about what BNDES has been doing in this area.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Talking about adaptation is something really, it's not new, because we are talking that it's new, but it's not new when we talk about our support on the environmental agenda. BNDES is the Brazilian Development Bank, a national one, 100% owned by the government. And as a national development bank, we have one great objective, is that to support the public policies to be implemented and how these policies achieve their goals. First of all, Brazil is a country that have a historical policy in climate agenda, and since 2009 we have our national policy on climate change, and this national policy constructed the National Climate Fund, is the Brazilian National Climate Fund, and BNDES is the manager of this National Climate Fund. For sure, we finance projects either in mitigation and adaptation with the resources of these funds, but it's really nice to be the one that speaks after Vivian, because after 10 years managing the climate fund, and the interest rates are really low for even municipalities to get more resilient, or to projects, infrastructure projects that can use these funds, we saw that it's not a question of finance. It's not just a question of money or the cost of the money. When we talk about adaptation, we are talking about something deeper than mitigation. First of all, and as Vivian said, the regulations are most important in that way. Because when us, as banks, receive the infrastructure project there to be financed, and this went from, for example, the Minister of Infrastructure, this project get many steps to arrive to the bank to be financed. And then when arrive to the bank, and then you do the screening, oh, there is an adaptation framework I receive, it's okay, okay, and I say, oh, you are not using this technology, I will not. So sometimes if I said this, I will not finance, they will not go to the first step, and probably it gets 5, 7, 10 years from the beginning till the finance, and say, no, now you arrive here, you need to go back 10 years ago and then come back again here 10 years later. So it is a matter of regulation. It is a matter of how you implement in a policy way. As I said, we are instruments of public policy. So how the public policy is facing adaptation into urban resiliency and infrastructure. How can we support it? Okay, and another thing is about technology. Because when we talk about adaptation, we are talking about technology. Which kind of technology, which kind of method I will support in some projects to face the risks that that infrastructure need to be resilient. So I think we have this three big axes of working. How we can help on building capacities for the first steps of the projects, not only when they arrive to be financed. The second one is related to how we support the environmental innovation system to find the solutions, the technical solutions for the problems in the future related to these risks. And the last one is financing. Okay, this technology probably will be more expensive. How I make low costs in the interest rates or more time to pay the financing debt for the bank. So I think these three pillars are important. But when we are talking about credit, I don't know if all the banks here have the same mandate as BNDES. BNDES is not only a credit development bank. We have equity too, and we have a new agenda that is bigger now, is the agenda of modeling projects, modeling infrastructure projects for the national level and the subnational level. And when we talk about it, then we have a very important role because we participate in the beginning of the projects, not only at the end when we go with the money to be financing. So what we are doing, as I said, we already have these special resources from the National Climate Fund in the financing way. But we are trying now and working a lot with some partnerships in Brazil, especially UK, the UK Pact. We had the Brazilian Green Finance Program, and BNDES is one of the partners of the UK Pact. And we are working on how we can make this checklist when we will begin the structuring or modeling the projects at the beginning with the federal government and the subnational levels. So we are working a lot on it, and it's capacity building. Probably we will. We are trying some pilots how to use these rules or this checklist, and we are in some segments like sanitation, for example, that adaptation is really important in sanitation projects. Now we are facing big problems in Brazil without water. For example, it's not raining anymore like in the past, so we need to face this kind of situation in the next years. So we are working on it, and probably for the next year or the next few years we will have something really solid to show for many sectors, not only these new ones that we are working now as pilot to try to understand better how and when we can act to assure that that project will be resilient for the new climate situation that can be faced in the territories. So I think this is our contribution. Now we are working on these three different levels, not only in the credit, as I said, but most in modeling the projects for the national and subnational levels. This is the adaptation agenda that we are facing on projects in infrastructure and sanitation. But historically, we work a lot in adaptation for small farmers in the Northeast Brazil. We have a very long history in specific projects for small farmers in Northeast of Brazil that is a arid. I don't know if it's in English is the same. It's a semi-desert place in Brazil, and we have worked for the last 10 years trying to find the best technological frames to people get more resilient to the dry seasons that there is being even more harder in the last years. So we can make any exchange on it, but as I said, we made it supporting public policies, national public policies on adaptation for small rural properties.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nabil, because I think that provides, does put that question out there that often we do talk about the financing needed, the investment needing, but often, obviously there needs to be a sign that financing will be available, but it's not just having money on the table that's really going to bring, projects or, the broader kind of systems level changes that might be needed. And the role, of course, that an institution such as BNDES can do in building that capacity. And I think there at the end, you've highlighted very clearly the broad range of topics that an institution such as BNDES will be working across, whether it's small-scale agriculture in a semi-arid area, or is it going to be again thinking about these other areas around infrastructure, around sanitation, et cetera. So it's a very broad set of challenges. And of course, I think all public development banks are seeking impact, and this is where I would now turning to our next speaker, Sarah. Who is joining us online again from the EBRD, who can tell us a little bit about the work of the MDBs and EBRD, of course, as one of the MDBs in general, about measuring adaptation impact of interventions. So, Sarah, over to you.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay? Is it working, yeah?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I don't have any slides to present today, but I just kind of wanted to talk around three main areas, and I think it reflects a lot on what's already been discussed and the points that have been raised. The points that I want to talk about are kind of financing and the tracking of the finance, and then secondly on results and how we measure them, and thirdly on the role of private finance as well as public. So when it comes to finance, I mean, obviously, as I think one of the opening remarks was around the Paris Agreement and the Global Adaptation Goal, and that we won't be able to achieve that without significantly scaling up finance for adaptation. So we really need efficient and reliable ways of tracking adaptation finance, and that, I think, will actually incentivize more and better flows of adaptation finance if we have a clearer way of tracking it. It'll also minimize the transaction costs and the bureaucracy that sometimes can inhibit the financing of adaptation projects. With the MDBs jointly together, we have over 10 years of experience of tracking adaptation finance using the common principles that are sort of set out between us. And we're currently in the process of revising and improving our approach, developing these common principles, taking into account wider developments in the market, such as things that are happening around EU sustainable finance taxonomy, emerging definitions and standards. There are ISO standards that are developing on adaptation finance tracking, and also links to things like green bonds, climate resilience bonds, etc. And some of the work that we're doing is around kind of making sure we all speak the same language. I know that we use the words as sort of resilience of projects and resilience through projects. We also use language around projects which are adapted and projects which are enabling, and that's sort of more the language in the EU taxonomy. And so a lot of the work that we need to do is to make sure we're all saying the same things and we're meaning the same things when we talk about adaptation finance tracking and what it is that we're looking at. There's also a lot of the work that we're doing is building on the experience that we've had of implementing this approach for the last 10 years or so. And the lessons learned paper, which was released by the MDBs back in 2018, there were 6 key lessons that were presented there and that we're kind of using to develop our approach. One of the lessons was that there was actually a lot of consensus between MDBs, and particularly around using a process-based approach and the 3 steps that we have set out. So Step 1 is around setting out the context of climate vulnerability, or vulnerability to climate change. Step 2 is on making an explicit statement of intent, and step 3 is on articulating a clear link between the context of climate vulnerability and the project finance that we're attributing. So whilst there's still a lot of consensus, there's also areas where there's still a range of approaches that are used. For example, in how we determine the shares of project costs that can be counted as adaptation finance. And I think that's a natural and normal difference between MDBs and between other financing institutions, because there are a range of different approaches which can be used and which are all valid. And also the MDBs have different business models. As Nabil mentioned, we invest in different types of things. And we have different methods of engagement with our clients and different mandates for why we're doing certain investments. There's been a lot of experience gained since using these common principles. For example, a lot of experience on how to set the context for tracking project level adaptation finance, and also how to integrate technical considerations into projects. And that experience has really helped to build a lot of institutional capacity in the MDBs and also IDFC members. And so there's really a lot more people these days with the skills and knowledge on adaptation than there were before, as a result of using these principles and as a result of the tracking. The final lesson learned is that the experience with adaptation finance tracking has pointed to the need to define and report the results of the adaptation project and financing. So that takes me on then to the second point that I wanted to talk about, which is on results. So it's not enough for us to just measure the finance that we're providing. We also aim to measure the results of that as well. It's really important that we can have more knowledge about the impact that our financing is having on the ground and how it's really helping to build climate resilience in a broader sense. So EBRD, as well as other MDBs, have begun to develop ways to track and report on the results of our adaptation financing activities. At EBRD, we are looking at the outcomes that our projects are delivering in terms of what they contribute to climate resilience. So this can be outcomes such as increased water availability in the face of increasing climatic variability, or it might be things like a reduction in weather-related damage and disruption from extreme weather events, flooding, for example. And our approach is set out in our Green Economy Transition Handbook, and it shows what we look at in terms of climate resilience outcomes. But again, this is only really looking at outcomes. We're still yet to develop a more comprehensive methodology as to how we can really measure the full impact. And this is quite difficult technical work. Other MDBs are doing similar work, and Veronique is going to speak after me about the work that World Bank are doing. And we regularly share our experiences, and I don't know how many times we must have shared case study examples between the different MDBs, and we really want to work together to deliver this and develop the next level of reporting results for our projects. But more work is needed to develop this approach and make it more mainstream as well, because we really need to develop more widely recognized frameworks that not just MDBs, but also governments, national development banks, other financiers, including the private sector, can coordinate their efforts around. That then brings me on to my third point, which is about the role of the private sector as well as the public sector. So we only need to look at the figures to see that we need to engage with the private sector in order to finance climate resilience at scale. The investment needs, they're far greater than the amount of finance available from the public sector and from aid budgets. So we really do need to bring in the private finance into the discussion. And we need frameworks for adaptation finance tracking and results reporting that make sense for the private sector as well. So there's a growing focus on physical climate risk reporting and disclosure in TCFD style climate and sustainability reporting. And I think that gives us an idea as to what the sort of metrics might look like. And I mean, crucially though, this really needs to be done in a way that kind of crowds in private finance where it's needed for climate resilient investment. and avoids driving it away from climate vulnerable countries and sectors. So we need to make sure that that is the focus as well as we start to develop these frameworks and these metrics systems. So that's, I want to kind of leave the floor open for questions as well towards the end. So I'll finish here and hand over. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. And I think that's really useful to say that part of this process, and particularly perhaps as institutions are delving more into this topic of how they can support adaptation and these and the adaptation goal, of course at the highest level, but does begin about identifying a common language and how the financial community has worked to develop that common language, whether it's from initial definitions to, as you noted, talking about results, and now taking that next step to really trying to see the broader impacts that might be going on out there. And as well, I think that great connection you made to the growing conversation of climate-related risks, and going back, of course, to Michael's presentation in the first part of how the risk conversation is very important, but from a public development bank perspective, we need to make sure that risk conversation, when we're thinking about adaptation, isn't driving finance and investment and support away from where it's needed most, because it's seen as being at high risk. So there's definitely connections to make across these different conversations that, of course, again, are probably happening potentially in very different parts of institutions at time. So as you mentioned, and as you said, you've been working with quite a bit, I'd like to now turn to Veronique, who's joining us online from the World Bank, to say a few words about the resilience rating system that they're using to ensure resilience of, and again through, those two ideas, a process or a project, not a process. So Veronique, over to you. And please, again, do let me know when you'd like me to advance slides.
Great, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great.
Yes.
So if you could maybe just start projecting the slides. Okay. So thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to give an update on the development of the resilience rating system, which is the World Bank's new methodology for building and tracking resilience to climate change. The methodology was released earlier this year in February, and we're now in the process of piloting it internally on some of our operations. So first of all, why a new resilience rating system? Well, as we've all been discussing here today, climate change and disaster risk considerations need to be considered, integrated, and embedded into project design. So to maximize development benefits is critical to ensure that our investments are robust throughout their entire lifetime to a changing climate. So to help align climate and development, the newly launched resilience rating system provides a simple approach to measure and disclose the extent to which adaptation and resilience considerations have been integrated into project design. And as the line on the slide so eloquently states, at the end of the day, the goal is not really just to rate projects. The goal is to do good projects. Next slide, please. So what exactly is the resilience rating system? It's a process to support adaptation and resilience considerations in project design, with the rating assigned from a C to an A+ to reflect the level of integration of climate. From the World Bank's perspective, it was really designed to improve tracking of World Bank progress on adaptation and resilience, and to help create incentives to engage in more and better adaptation. But the objective was to develop a rating system that could be used by others and become a standard. For other development agencies, it would be relatively straightforward. They'd have to adjust the way it's done in their own processes and their project pipeline, but the way that they look at this issue is very similar. The way the rating system is implemented by the private sector would likely be a bit different, but the objectives and the needs are quite similar. Private sector projects also need to consider climate risks in their design, and private investors have been asking for simple standards and metrics to help them select the best projects from a resilience perspective. The rating system could also be used by governments and local authorities, and we're also actually piloting this in South Africa. So municipalities could use this to inform their own projects and investments. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to see if this tool can be part of the project investment management systems that governments use to manage their own projects. And just to be clear, the resilience rating system is not an indicator that will give evidence to measure resilience outputs or outcomes. So it does not measure climate impacts. It is about ensuring that the project design process adequately incorporates climate and disaster risk into project preparation. But that being said, in order to get an A+, a project must include climate results tracking in its project design. So we've been talking a lot about these two dimensions, and just to kind of go over that again, the first is the resilience of the project design. So the extent to which a project's financed assets have considered climate and disaster risk in their design. And essentially with this dimension of the rating system, we want to look at how resilient are our projects and will they still deliver in spite of climate change impacts? For example, in the agriculture sector, if there are shifts in seasonal patterns and crop yields and pest outbreaks due to climate change, how is the project incorporating that into its design? The second dimension of the resilience rating system is the resilience through the project outcomes, or how is a project enhancing the resilience of the targeted sector and beneficiaries through its interventions? Basically, how much do our projects contribute to people's resilience? And distinguishing between these two dimensions is really important because at the end of the day, we want all of our development operations to be resilient and adapted to future climate conditions, right? It doesn't make sense to invest in ill-adapted infrastructure and activities. On the other hand, not all development operations need to focus on resilience. There are other development goals, and depending on the specificity of the context and the client's needs, there may be times when resilience outcomes are especially important or when it might be a secondary priority. So the point of the resilience rating system is that it provides a transparent and fully disclosable process for understanding the level of climate ambition. And interestingly enough, on the two dimensions, when we first started working on this resilience rating system, we thought that investors and others would be more interested in the resilience of dimension, but actually more and more we find that people want to demonstrate how they're actually building resilience through. So that's something that's been interesting as we've learned through the development of the methodology. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to present a high-level overview of the resilience rating system, starting with the framework for resilience of the project design, and just a few general comments on the overall framework, and then I'll go into the details of each rating. So first, the rating is expressed in letter grades, C to A+, and just to mention that one rating is not captured in the schematic, which is not exposed. So that obviously means that the project is not exposed to climate and disaster risks, either based on the nature of the project activities or as a result of the risk screening. Secondly, a higher rating denotes higher confidence that the expected rate of return of an investment will be achieved and that the project will remain beneficial despite the negative impacts of climate change on the investment. And third, the ratings build upon each other. So an A+ rating is dependent on meeting the previous criteria. So let's focus on the resilience of the project design. And to get a C rating, that's achieved when a climate and disaster risk screening has been completed and a project has identified relevant short and long-term risks over the lifetime of the project. So right now, all World Bank projects are at least rated a C through the fulfillment of the climate and disaster risk screening corporate commitment. A B rating is achieved when risk assessment has been conducted and adaptation options have been identified, assessed, and considered. And a risk assessment goes beyond a screening in that it evaluates a project's sensitivity to the climate and natural hazards based on specific assets, as well as impacts to the beneficiaries and project activities. So the B rating builds upon the risk screening from the C rating to integrate adaptation options during project design. And then finally, a project moves from a B to an A when, in addition to the requirements for a B, a task team incorporates a stress test on the residual disaster and climate risks in the economic and financial analysis. And it reports on how, despite these risks, the project remains economically or financially viable. So we're working on tools and data to support pilot projects to get the A rating and adequately integrate climate and disaster risk considerations into their economic analysis. So in a nutshell, to achieve an A rating, a project needs to show that it remains economically and financially viable, given possible climate and disaster impacts. And finally, just to mention the plus rating, which can be an extension of the B and the A rating, and it's essentially applied when the project includes contingent planning to adjust the project should unanticipated changes occur. So now on to the resilience through. A C-rated project would just be a standard development project that reduces poverty. So again, essentially all World Bank projects are at least at a C. A B rating is assigned when a project has identified risks and vulnerabilities posed by climate change and natural disasters, and has intentionally included appropriate activities designed to contribute to resilience building. So the activities should do more than just protect the outcomes of the project, for example, like making a bridge more resilient, but also boost the resilience of the users or beneficiaries or areas. So for example, the bridge makes a population more resilient by facilitating access in the case of flood. To do this, task teams should consider and understand the wider context in which the project is taking place, as well as intentionally consider what aspects of resilience the project can help strengthen. And finally, the A rating is reserved for projects that not only boost the resilience of beneficiaries through their outputs, but that are also quote unquote transformational. And here the term transformational refers to projects that influence resilience for adaptation beyond their direct outputs because they affect upstream policies, strategic planning, or remove obstacles that other similar projects face. And this is where, in this dimension, there's a possibility for a plus rating, and that is applied if the project monitors the progress of resilience building activities through at least one climate or disaster resilience indicator. Next slide, please. And then finally, I wanted to highlight some of the World Bank tools and processes that are being used to help support the piloting of the resilience rating system. Many of these are available externally. So on the one hand, we're drawing upon existing tools and data and information sources such as the Think Hazard site, which provides a general view of the hazards for a given location that should be considered in project design and implementation. And the Climate Change Knowledge Portal, which provides climate data and climate risk information that users can use to define, understand, and communicate future climate change scenarios. We're also drawing on and piggybacking onto some of our existing corporate commitments on climate, such as the climate and disaster risk screening, which is really the foundation, the base, in order to get the C rating. The climate finance tracking methodology, which Sarah just spent some time discussing, for adaptation finance, which requires disclosure of adaptation and resilience measures, and climate indicators, which requires some of our projects to include at least one climate indicator in the results framework to monitor and track the progress of climate results. We're also working on developing some new tools. So complementary to the resilience rating system methodology, we recently published a note on integrating climate change and natural disasters into the economic analysis of projects, a disaster climate risk stress test methodology. And for this purpose, our team has developed an Excel-based tool called the Risk Stress Test Tool to estimate the impacts on the cost and benefit flows of a project's net present value. And the methodology accounts for changes in average climate conditions, impacts from natural disasters, and changes in the frequency of disasters. I won't go into too much detail about that tool now, as another colleague from our team will be presenting in tomorrow's session on making climate finance work in an uncertain world. But essentially, we've been piloting this methodology, and it's given us the opportunity to really further develop some of the tools and understand where some of the challenges lie. And I think two takeaway lessons so far from the piloting. The first is that it's really important to get involved as early as possible in the stages of project preparation. So it's really important to have the discussions with task teams, with the client as soon as possible to see how we can incorporate climate, because sometimes it just hasn't been, something that's brought onto the radar of the client in a certain aspect. And the second thing that I wanted to say is that what we have found particularly difficult in some cases is the climate data. So even though we do have these tools, there are still obviously some uncertainties that exist out there. And so sometimes it can be challenging in terms of really trying to develop these tools in a systematic way, but leave room for the uncertainties that exist out there in the climate data world still. So with that, I'd just like to thank you for your attention. And we continue to pilot this methodology and look forward to future engagements to discuss further progress.
Great. Thank you so much, Veronique. I think that was a very useful deep dive into really how you can start developing and applying those criteria for ratings, whether again it's about that resilience of or resilience through. And I think you know, a lot of interest, and I'm sure you'll get a lot of questions. And of course, in the initiative as well, we'll be happy to see how to also share experience around the different set of tools that you already have kind of in your toolbox, as well as those that are under development. I'm really happy because we're actually on time, which is great. So now I do want to turn to our final panelist, Christophe from the AFD, who will say a few words about how they're supporting countries to implement adaptation strategies. And of course, I do invite everyone while Christophe is speaking to start thinking about any questions you might have or comments you would like to bring into the conversation, as we definitely will be having time for Q&A, which is always great. So Christophe, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your invitation. As you know, AFD mobilized 5.2 billion euros of climate finance in 2020, among them 40% of adaptation. But I will not talk about it precisely today. I will talk about a small tool that we have called Adaptation that tries to contribute to those results. I have some slides to show, please. Ah, sorry. Adaptation has been born in 2017 for 4 years. We are actually in the 5th year. We've been affected by COVID too. It was endowed with a grant of 30 million euros to operationalize the Paris Agreement and to become a driving force in speeding up climate investments. We do that through studies and capacity building activities. We've been operating in 15 countries and regional organizations, mostly in Africa, in LDCs, in seeds. You can see the list of the partner countries here: Dominican Republic, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, Cuba, Niger, Congo, Brazzaville, Senegal, Guinea-Conakry, Tunisia, Côte d'Ivoire, Cameroon, Ghana, Comoros, Madagascar, Mauritius, IOC. We were actually here this morning with 2 of them, with Mauritius and Senegal, to launch the second phase of adaptation. And one of the words that was raised by Mauritius, talking about the partnership that we have with them, is the word catalyst. And that's precisely what we are trying to do here with adaptation through 3 components. The first is dealing with governance. It was operated by Expertise France. The second is about public policies, so as to better include adaptation in sectoral public policies. For example, we've been have been doing a study in Niger to better include adaptation in the future strategy of development of agriculture, through also a plan and a list of projects that could be funded afterwards. The third component is about the preparation of projects. So we have the first 2 components that are dealing with an enabling environment. So we come back to some of the previous presentations. And the third one is about feasibility and vulnerability studies, so as to foster the emergence of projects. Let me share with you one results that we have had so far. The initial objective of the project was to have a leverage effect of 500 million euros of projects with a target of 30 projects supported. Today, we have overcome largely this objective because we have reached 584 million euros of projects that have been approved by AFD's board through 7 projects. Among them, we have mainly loans, but also 136 million euros grants. You have here the list of the projects that we have been supporting through adaptation, through vulnerability and feasibility studies, or by doing studies that have been inspiring to launch this project with our colleagues of the sectoral divisions. The first project is a contingency loan in Mauritius that is largely contributing to the big results that we have had. The second project is about hydromet services in Indian Ocean, a project that has been co-funded by the GCF. The third one is about resilient agriculture in the north of Ivory Coast. The third about climate services in Ivory Coast too. The fifth one, is about the development of a breeding sector in Niger. Interestingly enough, the feasibility study that we have been conducting there was initially supporting a grant for a project of 10 million euros. And finally, the authorities added a loan of 4 million euros to this project to scale this project up, this project. Then we have supported the emergence of a project about agroecological transition in the Senegal River Valley. And lastly, we have been supporting vocational training in Madagascar. On top of that, we have 14 additional projects in the pipeline, which make us hope that the potential total leverage effects in the medium term could reach 1 billion euros for 21 projects, still funded by AFD or co-funded by GCF counterparts of the EU. We have also to add here that we consider that we also have mainstreaming effects. So we are completely in the topic today because we have five regional coordinators on the field, and they co-construct every support with the local authorities and with the different stakeholders. That's the reason why we esteem that we're also a mainstreaming tool, both internally within AFD, but also with our counterparts. And this mainstreaming effect is completely invaluable because it will contribute to future projects that we won't be able to count in the project, but that will be really and change the situation in the partner countries. I have to say also that we have just launched a second phase this morning that will mainly cover the same topics with still the investment as a core of the project, but through a triptych with understanding, planning, acting. And the third component will also try to foster new types of projects. So not only agriculture and water, that was mainly the topics that we dealt with in the initial phase, but more with biodiversity, with health, with protection, with adaptive social protection, and especially the nexus biodiversity, climate, society that has been raised in the recent IPBES and IPCC report. To do that, I will also mention, I will quote a previous intervention that was speaking about knowledge, and we realized to what extent knowledge was important in the first phase. So we have added one component about knowledge specifically to fund operational research that will help the two other components about enabling environment with governance and policy, public policies, but also for projects to be more robust according to the scientists who will work. We will mostly focus on the human dimensions of adaptation. So we won't do additional modelizations, but we'll try to take advantage of the existing data to try to mobilize the different actors and to better understand the networks, the barriers, the opportunities, the different tools that are needed for the decision makers to take better and more robust decisions, also taking into account uncertainty, which is always difficult. And we'll also have another component related to knowledge, namely a knowledge management and outreach component, because we assessed that through the 75 different supports that we had, we have numerous studies that we haven't been able to share properly in the first phase. So we'll have a specific component about knowledge sharing, both between the different countries in a south-south direction with peer-to-peer workshops that we haven't been able to do in the first phase, mainly due to COVID. But we will also try to foster south-north streams of knowledge, because there are some results, some studies that we have been conducted in our partner countries that doesn't exist in France. I'm thinking about a study about education and the place of adaptation within the educational system in Senegal that doesn't exist at least as far as I know, in France. We'll also add a gender component to ensure that is more mainstream within the project. Teliska, my colleague who is here, will speak precisely here tomorrow morning about this gender component. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Christophe, for, I think, many concrete examples of exactly what this can look like in practice, but also bringing it back to this kind of key issue that's been maybe the thread weaving together much of what we're talking about on today's panel, looking at that role of knowledge and capacity, and of course what we're aiming to do here together, which is sharing that with one another. So I promised everyone that there would now be time for questions, and it looks like we have about 15 minutes left in today's session. So what I would like to do is to open it up to the floor here in the room. And then, I don't know, Alice, if you're also being able to look online for those participating live via, I believe it's on YouTube. I'm not sure which streaming channel it is. We'll get the questions as well as from wherever you're watching. We'll find some way to bring them to the room. So I don't know if there are any questions from those of you here. Yes, yeah. If you want to just actually hop back up, and even Christophe, if you want to come back up on the stage, that would be great.
Thanks. I made a presentation, but I have a question. Veronique, for you, about the World Bank screening process of adaptation in projects. Really nice to see the result of this work. And there is one question. What kind of thing do you do with this information? In the process of analyzing a project in the World Bank, after screening it on the adaptation framework, which kind of process or consequences the project faces if A, B, or C in that scale? Do you do anything else after screening it? And which kind of thing? Is there anything related to the rate or any kind of recommendation? It would be really nice to know better the next steps.
Did you want me to go ahead and answer, or did you want to take a few questions?
Well, perhaps what I can do is I'll just read. There's 2 more questions that have come in online. So I'll read those out now, and then I'll let you respond, Veronique, and then, of course, I'll let anyone else in our panel. And I also see we're joined by Morgan Nicol, who's our program director at I4C for Territories, who worked with Vivian on the work he presented today, who is also online to potentially add in as well. So the 2 other questions we have received, the first is, do you believe in a future common shared indicator to measure and tackle climate risk? Here, physical and transitional, but I think here we'll probably definitely be focusing on that physical component. And are the initiatives considering financing innovations such as green bonds or transaction of potential Article 6 emission reductions when developing finance tools? And perhaps here, while that may seem a little bit off the cuff, we have had some conversations about how do you actually again bring that funding in for adaptation, and can we begin to connect it up with other perhaps more traditional bread and butter ways of financing mitigation action. So perhaps with those three questions, I'll turn to our panelists. And of course, we'll start with Veronique and let others think about their responses while you answer Nabil's direct question.
Great, and thank you. Thank you for the question. It's actually a very important question. So for now, what we are doing is piloting and testing the methodology. So really, the methodology just came out early this year, and we're in the process of piloting it on about 20 World Bank operations across different sectors covering human development, infrastructure, sustainable development. So right now, the focus is really on, does this even make sense? Does this methodology make sense? What are the specific criteria for the A, B, and C? What are we finding in the operations? And so what we're finding through the piloting also is that we need to be able to develop some further tools, especially in order to get that A rating. We're finding it quite difficult to integrate it quantitatively into the economic and financial analysis of projects, and so more work has to be done on that. But essentially, to answer your question, for the moment, because the focus is just on the piloting and the process, there is no, okay, well, this project has a B and it has this implication, because really it's about the commitment that we have made is to develop the methodology, to pilot it, and to sort of adjust it as needed based on the results of what we're learning on the methodology. But of course, the trajectory of travel would be that eventually we would want to, apply this in a more whole-scale approach rather than just the piloting. And I will say that one thing that we're learning through the piloting process is that we find that the teams are really appreciating this process-oriented approach that takes you from step C to A, right? So right now, our teams are all required to do the climate and disaster risk screening. So that is a requirement. So all of our teams do that. They cannot move forward if they have not been able to show that they've screened for climate and disaster risks. But as we kind of move into getting them closer to Bs and to As, we're finding that teams, as long as we are able to engage early enough, it's allowing them the opportunity to think about other ways to build in adaptation and resilience in their projects that they might not even thought about. So in addition to sort of, making sure that your project is adapted to climate and making sure, the resilience of dimension, it's allowing opportunities to build in elements in the project of resilience through. And so I think that's also been an interesting experience. On the question of the common shared indicator, I mean, my feeling is that, that adaptation is so context specific that it would be difficult to have, any one common shared indicator. But potentially there could be some sectoral indicators that could apply to different sectors across the spectrum. But I think, adaptation is so context specific that it is quite difficult to come up with some kind of commonality amongst all of us. And with that, maybe I'll pass it over to the others.
Great. Thank you so much, Veronique. And now here, of course, I'd like to look around at my panelists in the room and then also those online to see if anyone else would want to add in to what Veronique has already said, or maybe take up again, those questions we did receive. Yes.
Maybe just a word about the indicators. There may be a need to have common indicators for development bank to account for climate finance related to accountability here in COPs. But there is also a need of indicators to assess the results that we have on the ground. And that's a discussion that we had also this morning with IDRI, with Alexandre Magnan, because we funded through Adaptation a study about a potential new tool called Gap Track to try to assess the results and the progress of adaptation and to assess to what extent we really reduce the vulnerability. And for that, I'm not sure that we need a common indicator, but probably a list of different indicators, different methodologies that will be discussed afterwards for the global goal of adaptation. But I need that we also need this type of indicator.
And I think that's a very good point, because obviously each indicator needs to fit the given need, whether it's more on the reporting during the around the different aggregating exercises that are done around climate finance and investment. Also, again, that key point of understanding the impacts and then being able to share on, what type of interventions or support can maybe scale up that impact, so we do reach scale both on the adaptation side as well as mitigation. I don't know if any other of our online panelists would like to come in on that first round of questions.
Yeah, I can also add on the indicators. I agree with Veronique, and it's very difficult to have one common indicator. I think that's not possible because it's so context specific, and development banks are doing different things, even if they're financing the same project, or we might be involved in different stages or have different information available, or the finance that we're giving might be going to do different parts of the same project. So it's not necessarily possible to have one indicator that says, okay, this project scores a 7, and we all understand what that means, because there's just so many different factors at play. But I think what is important is having common principles and common understanding about sort of the process of adaptation. And it's not a yes/no question or a sort of score out of 10. It's sort of everybody having more understanding of what is involved in how you make something resilient, how you increase general resilience, how you improve the system, and what that entails. So yeah, and I'm not sure we'll ever get to a final one indicator, but I think the work in trying to get there has other benefits.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. I don't believe we have any more questions online, but I do see a question in the room. I don't know if we have a roving mic. Oh yeah, if you can pass, here we go, pass that back. So, and Alex, you might need to stand there to be visible
Sure.
online. I know there's a camera that gets that corner.
Hello, everyone. Many thanks for the discussions. I am Alexis Bonnel, working with the French Development Agency. And I actually have 2 questions to all panelists. There are 2 streams that have been discussed these past few days quite a lot in the negotiations. One of them is around legal action against those who would not be implementing enough mitigation or adaptation objectives. Do you see a potential use of the different tools that you have developed that could serve as a basis for legal action against, for instance, financial institutions that would not be developing or implementing proper adaptation approaches? And a second stream, second topic that is discussed quite a lot these days is about the alignment of counterparts. And I was very much interested by, of course, the resilience rating system and the different approaches that many of you have presented around project-based resilience of projects through projects. What about resilience of institutions and through institutions? Have you started working on that? Could that be another area of interest to make progress on the topic? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Alexi, for 2 very good questions when we only have about 3 minutes in theory. I don't know if we can run over by a couple of minutes, but I would like to give an opportunity to each panelist to respond. I don't know if we have anyone who'd like to volunteer, or Nabil, if you want to.
I can begin with the first question of Alexis. I think, Alexis, in the case of Brazil, this kind of legal basis will be made by the central bank. Our central bank set a lot of new regulations this year related to climate agenda in financial institutions in Brazil. So from the middle of next year on, they will regulate us as financial institutions to see how we are dealing with climate issues in all the agendas that we work, not only on credit, but equity too, modeling processes. Every institution, financial institution in Brazil will need to have a system internally, a management system to deal with climate risks and climate agenda in all the work of the bank. So I think this agenda in Brazil will be fastened by the Brazilian Central Bank. The legal will be there looking to us if we are dealing with mitigation and adaptation. They are talking about transitional risks, physical risks, all the things related to climate. So we will be needing to adapt all the way that we work in the next 1 year and a half. So for us, it will be a really big challenge, but we will face it. In Brazil, is that situation now. Financial institutions will need to have it done in 1 year. So let's see how we will work on it.
Great. Thank you so much, Nabil. Christophe, or how about our online panelists? Veronique, Sarah, and then Sarah, excuse me, I'll stop putting a French accent on everyone's name. And then but also Vivian and Morgane as well, if you are online and would like to maybe respond to, again, that question around, you know, that legal exposure that we're seeing in the conversation, but also this idea, you know, alignment through and of clients and counterparties and maybe even intermediaries.
On the point about the kind of alignment through and of our counterparties, it is something that we're looking at as well in the MDB group, is the financing, and also in terms of Paris alignment on kind of how when we lend on to other financial institutions, and how we can ensure that those projects or that lending is aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So it is something that we're covering, and it's obviously less easy to put boundaries around that than it is with our direct lending investments. And so it's a work in progress, I would say.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Veronique or Vivian?
Maybe a very quick word, not to jump away the question, but just I think based on what we have seen, at least in the context we studied, I think that we are really at a step for which the idea is really to make sure the question is raised, and that all the different actors are proactive in raising the question of adaptation, and that's, I think, a very first step, even before raising these issues of the legal engagement and so on, is really to make sure that the different counterparts have consistent adaptation strategies and adaptation pathways we can actually monitor and follow to invest in adaptation. So I really think that we are still, maybe unfortunately, I don't know, in the emerging phase in many contexts, and that's phase for which the challenge is really to try to incentivize all the actors to move on this question adaptation, to take ownership of those tools, of those methodologies, to move on this topic. And maybe this kind of question will come again in a few years.
Great, Veronique.
Sure, maybe just to add quickly, I mean, I think I agree with Sarah and Vivian that it's a little bit earlier days for that, but just to add that I think the policy-based lending that some of the MDBs do, it also provides an opportunity there to help build the capacity of institutions towards Paris alignment. So I think that's one tool that we do have that could be useful for that.
Great, thank you. So I think and that ends our panel, I think, this evening. I think we're ending on an interesting note, because it does begin to explore two topics, perhaps for further discussions moving forward, which, of course, in our initiative, we always love to find. And I guess then I will, of course, thank our panelists and thank our introductory speakers. And I would like, of course, then to just invite everybody to our next event, which will be taking place tomorrow at 2 p.m. here in the IDFC Pavilion, both online and virtually, where we'll be exploring this question of uncertainty, and I believe the full title of that is Climate Finance Under Uncertainty. and we'll be exploring the different dimensions of that. Excuse me, as I don't have a slide with the name, and it's 7:30 p.m., so I don't remember the exact wording. But if that does interest you, please come and join us tomorrow at 2, as we do have a great lineup of speakers. But of course, a round of virtual and perhaps in-audience applause for our panelists this evening, and then have a great rest of evening as well. So. Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.